everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hoping you well. Today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Civil War once again get the #1 spot at the box office, surprisingly not being beaten out by the newcomer Abigail, a new horror film, and also not losing to what many thought would maybe be a resurgence for Godzilla x Kong. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about last week, even though there are still many people shilling for the Monsterverse that are not liking the things that I'm saying about the actual data when it comes to those movies. That ultimately, when you have a film losing to a film like Civil War in your third week of release, and now in your fourth week, you're also not really in that 1-2 discussion either, it's definitely showing you a sign of slowing down. At the very least, domestically, we have seen continued growth internationally, and we can say, as of this point, the film has essentially broken even based off of my typical charting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when you actually dive into the numbers of what studios actually get domestically, what they actually get internationally, typically what you see also from China as well. And we'll break those things down continuously as we go through. Before going any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, a lot of that fire button over on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So, of course, you also have plenty of new releases this week. We have the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare to talk about, Spy X Family Code White, which is technically a film from last year. So as you can see, it's already gotten a decent haul internationally in the markets that it has been released at over there. As of right now, it says that it's been released in South Korea. And that's the only one listed here on this chart. It looks like it did get a release in Japan, which of course would make a lot of sense, but no actual reporting from what we see here. My guess would be about 39 or so million, 39 to 40 million coming from that specific market. So again, we'll take that with a grain of salt. Also why I won't be charting that one officially. But let's go ahead and start off with Tony, good old Tony over at Deadline, saying Civil War brings audiences together with $11 million plus second weekend win, according to the Sunday AM box office update. Civil War is winning the box office skirmish against three wide releases with a second weekend of 11.1 million after 3.25 on Friday and 4.6 million on Saturday. This catapults the Alex Garland political thriller into A24's top 5. That's a 56% drop in the second weekend ease, which is a great hold for a movie that provoked a divided audience, a response with a B- cinema score. Now, of course, you already know what I'm going to say. The fact that Tony is even giving any credence to Cinema Score whatsoever is already a bit of a joke. That entire system is ridiculous, and how people tend to use Cinema Score as well also just does not actually correlate to actual reality itself. I much prefer looking at the actual real data itself and also trends, of which Cinema Score really does not give you anything because it gives you no data except for the score itself. And so let's actually talk about kind of the biggest part of this. Again, obviously, what you have Tony focusing on here is saying, well, you know, this movie is hanging around, and it's clearly a film that he might be showing somewhat of an affinity for because he's probably having that very specific political view, that political lens that some audience members might be having for it. Maybe he's reading into who the president in the movie is, things like that. You know what I mean. Let's just say he probably has a little bit of TDS, and so that's probably why he's enjoying the film from that perspective. But when you actually look at the film itself, it really doesn't go down that line. And so, jokes on you, Tony, for thinking something that is not actually true. You add on top of that the fact that what he's trying to say is this is an amazing, an amazing performance because of these wide releases, and it's beating them. Yes, but we have to also know what those wide releases are and what the expectations for those wide releases actually are, to see how impressive or not impressive this hold actually is. Ultimately, what I say is that the hold for Civil War is very strong, but has more so to do with how the film is doing individually and less so how it is doing in comparison to other films. You talk about a new film like Abigail, for instance. This is a horror film. This is a horror film with a moderately sized budget for a horror film, a movie that I have not seen a whole lot of promotion for. I'm not that interested in it myself, but it seems to have been getting some pretty good word of mouth, and so maybe we'll see this film do a little bit better as time goes on. But ultimately, not a film that anyone would have had on their bingo card as being a, quote, wide release, right? A major wide release, a major threat to getting in that #1, #2 spot at the box office in a typical year. We obviously have, right now out of the box office, just a lot of small to medium-sized films. The only real big movie is Godzilla x Kong, and now in its fourth week of release, it has now dropped down quite a bit, and it probably won't be able to recover because of the holds that we're seeing for some of these smaller fares. But to say that it's impressive because it did better than Abigail or did better than the Ministry of Ungenly Warfare is really not a good or fair talking point. Also, to mention something like Spy X Family Code White, which has been around, and therefore some people may have already gotten access to it beforehand because of its initial release. This is clearly also an anime film, and so there's a specific anime audience that is going to see this movie, and it's not going to be able to bring out your typical general audience moviegoers. So let's go ahead, just go to the actual charts themselves and see what they have to tell to us over at thenumbers.com. So after 2 weeks, Civil War from A24 is at $11.1 million and had a bit of a race on its hands with the newcomer Abigail. Now, when those actuals come out, sometimes this happens, right? Sometimes we can see a change of almost $1 million in some cases, so that could be enough to shift Abigail into the number one spot if that actually holds true. What we can say in both cases is that they are both doing very well. Civil War being the kind of movie that it is, and I mean by that specifically a film that did not cost a whole lot of money, though a lot more than probably what it should have costed, and enough to where it's likely going to still be a box office flop and not make its money back. More on that when we get to the chart at the end of the video. But what we are seeing from this is it is still performing, again, comparatively to what was expected, comparatively to what we have seen happening with this movie, especially with the backlash to it. A 56% hold is just very, very good. So the fact that this film is within about $1 million or so of a brand new horror film from Universal, hey, got to give credit where credit is due. Abigail coming in at $10.2 million here domestically. That's also, again, not that impressive for horror films. We've seen horror films do a lot better, but for a relatively unknown entity, I know that this is loosely based off of the daughter of vampire, whatever it might be. Story. It's a part of this Universal, monster, the other Monsterverse, right? You could say, and it is the one that's probably a lot more interesting to boot. But it is definitely more of a modern retelling of that tale versus it being more of a traditional telling of the tale. Seems to be getting some attention, at least from horror aficionados and people that are maybe fans of those old school monster horror films. So again, who knows whether this film's able to hold out in the long run or not. But based on these numbers right now, it's doing okay. And it's doing fine, but nothing to run home about. Godzilla now dropping to the number 3 spot. So only was able to have that domination at the number 1 spot for really just a couple of weeks. And for a film like that, you would typically expect it to be up there a lot longer. I mean, there's other films that we can talk about that have been out for a long, long time, who when they came out and when they were number 1, they were number 1 for quite a while. And as we all know, number 1 does not always automatically mean that you are good or bad, financially speaking. But to me, this speaks more to the point that I've been trying to make, which is that this is a much more international property than domestic. $171 million might be impressive when you compare it to a lot of the other films that have come out so far this year, but that's really not saying all that much when the films coming out this year that have not been doing as well as that are also just garbage movies, and movies that are a part of fan bases that have either been lost or continuing to be lost and bleeding members over a long period of time. It's nice to see Godzilla being able to, and the Monsterverse being able to recoup some of the numbers that were clearly lost in their last couple of films. So they're definitely a return to form. But you compare this film to 2014's Godzilla, the 2014 Godzilla film. You compare this even to Kong Skull Island, which I just cannot stand as a movie. Guess what? This film still has a long ways to go. And we've talked about this one at nauseum. I'll do a fuller breakdown of that just to showcase that even further on my article today over at geeksandgamers.com, which should be live sometime tonight or tomorrow with my box office breakdown. I'll do a special section on that if I can. Number 4 spot goes to the Ministry of Ungenly Warfare. This was a fine film, right? This was a mediocre film, not my favorite Guy Ritchie film. I think films like The Covenant from last year was better. I think especially a film like Operation Fortune, Rouge de Guerre. So even though like the basic premise is different, the execution is very similar. You have someone who is a part of this, governmental agency, political agency, and they are trying to get a band of people together to do something special. I mean, that's what you have in this movie. That's a lot of what you happen in Operation Fortune Rouge de Guerre as well. Operation Fortune being a much funnier film, having much better use of the typical Guy Ritchie characters as well, and making a film with Jason Statham not feel completely awful. So I do think that this film is definitely on the bottom of the barrel when it comes to his more recent movies. That being said, it is still fun. There's moments that I was laughing. I thought Henry Cavill was amazing in it, and I think that there's a lot of really good things to promote when it comes to this movie, but ultimately this film, it's probably not going to end up being a big box office hit based on the numbers that we're seeing right now. Spy X Family Code White, again from Crunchyroll, hard to say with this one. It's gotten a previous release. Not going to be able to track that one using my typical standards. Kung Fu Panda 4, after 7 weeks of release, is still in the number 6 spot, so it's still hanging around, 17% hold there. Still at almost over 3,000 screens, so clearly family's still going to show that. 24% drop there for Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, only out for 5 weeks and already dropping 241. It wouldn't surprise me to see Ghostbusters Frozen Empire be at less screens than even Kung Fu Panda 4 in the next couple of weeks, because it seems that one is doing just a little bit better than others. But again, Frozen Empire also just not that great of a film, and the box office, I think, is very much showing that. Dune Part 2 taking the number 8 spot, 2.9 million, 33% drop. This film is essentially finishing its theatrical run. And again, domestically, it's pretty much made all that it's going to make, $300 million. Probably not in the cards at this point. You never know, but probably not in the cards. It's still making a lot of money internationally. It has made its money back and made profits, but the profits for this film definitely not going to be as big as they were hoping. Monkey Man, $2.2 million, $46 million drop, 46% drop there. Again, not merely doing much. And then the first Omen, in its third week of release, dropping 55%. So this film dropping off the face of the earth quite a bit. But it was a lower budget film. We'll get into the charting of that in just a second. Anyway, Civil War at $48.1 million. It has now gotten a bit of an international release. Let's see if they have any updates on the charting there. I'd imagine the UK, if I had to guess. Yep, UK giving $2.2 million, about $500,000 from Australia. These numbers also are not always the most up to date, so always take them with a grain of salt until the actuals come in during the first couple of days of the week. But Civil War, again, for a film like this and for a film that had as much controversy around it, is doing so much better than what anyone would have expected. The big Achilles heel that this movie has, though, is that $50 million budget. They should not have spent $50 million on this movie. You can talk about how the effects look really cool, especially for the kind of movie that it is, but I feel like you could have made something looking as good, maybe even better, spending half that. And we've seen case in point of this with films like Godzilla -1, where they went with a $10-15 million budget and gave some of the best visual effects that we've seen in a very long time. It's not about how much money you're spending on them, it's how are you designing them and are you using them effectively and efficiently. And as of right now, I think that the budget's going to end up killing this movie, which is, again, getting a lot more momentum than what anyone would have expected. Abigail, $15.2 million there. So this is another film where, again, we'll get into the budget in a second, but still $15 million worldwide is a pretty decent opening. Godzilla x Kong, $485 million worldwide, but a huge portion of that's coming from China, right? $119 million of that coming from China. I've already talked about this long enough at this point, but again, because we don't know how much communist owned or Wanda Group owned, which again, communist group, owned Legendary, how much they actually get in their split with the Communist Party of China, we don't actually know how much profit this film is making in that regard until someone can actually point to an actual verifiable data point that they get 50% of the profits or 10% of the profits or whatever it might be. We know it's more than 25. That's all that we've gotten. Until then, though, that's a really bad sign for any movie to have a third of its entire international and therefore about a fourth or fifth of its entire box office coming from just that one country where they get very little return on investment. This film, though, is essentially broken even, but it's also not therefore going to be a huge box office profit moneymaker by the end of its run. Ministry of Ungenerated Warfare, interestingly enough, only got domestic numbers so far according to thenumbers.com. Spy X Family, as I mentioned, had a previous release, which is where that $40 million came from. $4.8 million there coming domestically. Kung Fu Panda 4 up to $480 million. Pretty crazy. The film is going to end somewhat close to $500 million. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire just was able to crack $100 million domestic and probably won't cover much else as far as milestones. $200 million probably not in the cards, and that's going to make it one of the lowest grossing films of that franchise, especially when you take into account inflation and also just the changing in ticket sales. Dune Part 2, $695 million. As I mentioned, my prediction several weeks ago at this point was that it's going to end somewhere in that $700 to $800 million range. It's looking like that's actually going to happen. This film also had a large chunk of its money coming from China, though it luckily also had large chunks coming from other European nations. So because of it not being as one-sided as a film like Godzilla was. That's why this film is a bit more profitable. But even then, right, because of how that market worked and because of how the difference domestic between international is, you get a higher share from the domestic than from the international. It's still not making as much as it potentially could have. Monkey Man, $26 million, and The First Omen at 45. Let's go ahead and get into the charts because we love doing charts here over at OMB Reviews. So first off, Civil War, right? We had the first 2 weeks for Civil War, so we can make some initial projections. And so as of the recording of this video and based off of historical standards, the total box office will be somewhere around 68 to maybe $100 million, right? 68 to around 96.3 is the official number there. This is just based off of how most films tend to perform after their first 2 weeks of release. I have a full article on this very method over at geeksandgamers.com. Go ahead and check out my articles over there if you want more information about that methodology specifically. But based on that, again, in a worst case scenario, if it follows typical trends, that would be 68 million. In a best case scenario, 96 million. Potentially could be better or worse, right? Could do more than double of what its current track is. Could do less than what the minimum projection is too. But as of right now, that's probably the likely scenario, especially since this film is performing a little bit better than what was expected. So think something closer to that maybe $80 to $100 million range if I had to guess. But even with that being the case, because it costs $50 million, that means it's going to lose somewhere between $33 and $17 million. So this film probably not going to make its money back. Again, it's good news in the fact that they're not losing as much as they initially thought. Let me go ahead and update this real quick. So it's always good to not lose as much as you thought, but it's also still a loss, and you can't take anything away from that. For the Ministry of Ungentlely Warfare, a $9 million start is a very, very poor start. $60 million budget. This film needs to make roughly $150 to $200 million to break even. Yeah, you're at around 84 to 100 plus million in the red right now, only 0.2 times your budget. In an era where you need to make roughly 2.5 to 3 times your budget, that is not a very good sign whatsoever. So right now, that film not looking that great. Abigail, this film is in a little better of a situation. It needs to make, or rather, it costs $28 million. Needs to make around 70 or so to break even, maybe between 70 and 85. And as of right now, it's at 15.2. So it's potentially in the cards, but you're also only starting at 0.5 times your budget. So unless this film gets a very strong word-of-mouth campaign, is able to really drive a lot of people out there, it's not looking like that is going to be a possibility for that film and for that franchise. Going into some of the other films we've talked about, let's see, The First Omen still at 17 million in the red. Probably not going to see that change anytime soon. We can now give an update there that as of right now, the first 2 weeks account for around 80% of its entire box office, so a huge portion of that. Probably won't see that change. Monkey Man, the first 2 weeks account for 85%. Technically has broken even. So I guess, hey, kudos to you for doing just enough, but definitely not a whole lot of money there. And then you go to Godzilla. Again, this is using the unfocused chart, right? Using my typical old school 2.5 multiplier. And I mentioned one of the problems in this new era of films is just how much more money is made in China versus internationally versus domestically. That does change your break-even point depending on where you're making that money, right? Because I can say I made $100 million, but if 70 million of that was made in China and 30 million was made in America, well, okay, I get 55% of that 30 million in America. I only get 25% of that 70 million in China. Okay, yeah, I need to make a lot more then to get to that same $100 million point, right? $100 million does not equal $100 million when you have to share those revenues with the studios, with the countries, or in the case of China, with the Chinese Communist Party. The film Immaculate is getting close to breaking even. We'll have to wait and see if that's actually able to happen, but not going to be a huge box office hit by any means. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, 44 million in the red. This film's not making its money back either, and I think those are really the only major films that we were talking about in that way. I did want to give just one more, again, focus, and I'll spend more time on this chart in my review over at geeksandgamers.com in just a little bit. But just to give an update on Dune Part 2 and also on the film Godzilla x Kong. So first, because of these new numbers that we now have, Dune Part 2 has made around $276 million domestically so far, $372 million it's made internationally without China, and then just in China alone, $46 million. So based off of those typical breaks, as I said, about 55% domestic, 40% international, 25% China, that means the film right now has made around $27.8 million in profits. So hey, that's a very, very good thing for them, obviously. If you're going to try to throw out there that, well, it's better because of Legendary's involvement with the Chinese Communist Party, again, we don't have any metrics. So don't use that as an excuse. In a best case scenario, the film would still be, maybe closer to 60 to 70 million in profit, which is good. but also not anywhere close to the $190 million it cost to make the movie, which means how do you justify making more films if you're not making the amount of money that you made back plus the amount you would need to actually pay for a new film? That's kind of the metric you think of when you think, okay, do I have a franchise here? Do I have enough headroom to be able to move forward with these projects? And the last one is Godzilla X Kong. So as you can see, right now the film is essentially broken even, right? So we have new and updated numbers here, $171 million domestic as of the recording of this video, international at $194 million. That is, of course, without China. With China, it is 119. With China's international total is $313 million. Without China, it's 194. China alone is 119. So as you can see, right, that's a lot of money coming from one country. And because we don't know, and that's why it's so important that we try to figure out what that percentage cut is between studio and also between Communist Party / country, studio, whatever it might be, theaters. And because right now the film is at negative $565,000. So again, very good number there as far as it's going to be officially. I can say, I've said this now for a while, it's going to make money, it's going to make profit, but the profits are definitely not going to be nearly as high as what many would have expected. It's going to be able to make more profits, for instance, versus Godzilla 2014, which had 1.7 million in profits, but that's just based off of this in an unadjusted rate, right? You adjust that 1.7 million in 2014 dollars into today's dollars. The question then starts to become, does Godzilla X Kong even have that capacity? And it's even worse when you think, okay, not only does it potentially have that capacity, but then this film also costs around 30 million less than Godzilla 2014. So if it's able to not make as much profit as Godzilla 2014, or barely get enough, or barely get a bit more profit than 2014's Godzilla when having spent 30 million less, I continue to ask that question of, where is the money coming from? Because we don't really have any official data points. I have people saying things like, well, the toys, the merchandise, and this or that. There's just not a lot of data being shared with me of, oh, here's the exact report. You can see that they've made X amount of money because of selling the rights. That would make more sense to me of, oh, they were able to sell the rights to this place, to that place. I think Warner Brothers, of course, is fine in all of this. The real question for me is about Legendary, specifically because they're the ones fronting 75% plus of these budgets for these overall films. So I want to give an update on that as well as for everything else. But right now, Civil War is dominating the box office. Now, I don't think that that's going to last forever. We can do just a quick live look. We love doing things live here on OMB Reviews about what we have coming up. We have a re-release of Alien, so it'll do fine, but let's just be honest, those typically aren't the number one film at the box office. The new film Challengers, which has gotten a lot of controversy. This is the one with Zendaya in it. Unsung Hero from Lionsgate. I don't know anything about that. So I do think you probably next week will see Civil War at least in the discussion. Where does Abigail fall? Where does Godzilla fall when all that happens? Because we are getting very, very close to May, and once May hits, then we have actual big releases with big budgets, big marketing budgets, starting off, of course, with May 3rd, The Fall Guy. A lot of money around that, a lot of attention on that, so I think that film will do very well. May 10th, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is again after that. So a ton of films coming out, and so what we thought was going to be pretty much a completely, unimpeded run for Godzilla X Kong has actually turned out to be a battle of the the medium budgeted movies to low budgeted movies, and where they're standing at the box office. So let me know your thoughts about this. Do you think the Civil War is going to stand in the top 3 next weekend? I think right now it is looking like that's going to be the case, and there's still a lot of debate over it. Overall, I still think the film was pretty good, and I think it is worth going to see. I think it is a very well done, well creative story that's able to stay out of the political messages. That, of course, is going to be something you hear very differently from anyone who brings in their own political biases into the movie itself. I did see Ministry of Undeadly Warfare, and it's fine. It's like a very decent, Guy Ritchie film, which makes it a rad film in a general sense. And I've heard some pretty good things about Abigail so far and a couple of the other things on here. But what are y'all's thoughts on this or anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below? And again, I do get these numbers based off of what's reported typically from Deadline, from thenumbers.com. And I know that some of their sites use something like this where it's ComScore. They have official reports of worldwide box office, and this is not updated yet. And so that's why some numbers could change between now and when this video goes live, but based on the numbers as they stand, these are my own thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, light up that fire button over on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my April Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off first with those members over on Patreon: Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel as Eagle Rider, and Miss Mountain Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name as well. To my Subscribe Star members, we have Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, and ZK Man, check out his channel xtheboundaries.ceo. That's where you can find his website and his other social media platforms. And also a huge shout out to my one YouTube Chosen of Valhalla member, Mr. Roy. Always awesome. Every single member of my Chosen is amazing. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream video or listed, access to a podcast, access also to a giveaways channel that I host over on my Discord server, or any of these other things that are offered, check out the top link in the video description below and become a member today. You guys are all amazing, and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Easter, and as always, God bless.